experience the intimate world of the Black Death. The day before, where every moment holds the weight of unspoken understanding. In this peaceful journey through time, you'll discover the quiet dignity of people living their daily lives, unaware of how their small gestures reveal the depths of human experience. The warmth from the bread ovens had settled into every stone of Elena's kitchen, creating an atmosphere where heat seemed to breathe from the very walls themselves. This gentle radiance, accumulated through years of daily baking, wrapped around her as she worked the dough with movements that had become as natural as breathing. The wooden table beneath her hands bore the smooth patina of countless loaves, its surface worn to silk by generations of bakers who had stood in this same spot, their hands following the same ancient rhythm that now guided hers. Elena pressed her palms into the yielding mass of flour and water, feeling the subtle transformation that occurred with each fold and turn. The dough responded to her touch with a patience that matched her own, neither hurrying nor resisting, simply accepting the work of her hands as it had accepted the work of her mother's hands and her grandmother's before that. In the persistent warmth that rose from the stones beneath her feet, she found herself thinking of all the women who had stood here, their movements creating an invisible choreography that she now performed without conscious thought. The kitchen held the accumulated warmth of the day like a living thing, and in this cocoon of heat and familiar scents, Elena's mind drifted to her mother's hands. She could see them still, dusted with flour, moving with the same deliberate grace that now guided her own movements. There had been something almost sacred in the way her mother had worked the dough, a reverence for the simple alchemy that transformed grain into sustenance. Elena had watched from a wooden stool, her child's eyes wide with wonder at the magic her mother performed each evening in preparation for the next day's bread. The gentle heat that radiated from the oven stones seemed to carry with it the essence of every loaf that had ever risen in this kitchen, every morning when the village had awakened to the scent of fresh bread drifting through the narrow streets. Elena could feel this history in her bones, in the way her hands moved without conscious direction, in the instinctive knowledge of when the dough had been kneaded enough, when it was ready for its long night's rest. The warmth was not merely temperature, but memory, not merely comfort, but continuity. As she worked, Elena became aware of the subtle sounds that filled the warm kitchen, the soft whisper of flour settling, the gentle creak of the wooden table accepting the pressure of her hands, the almost inaudible sigh of the dough as it yielded to her touch. These sounds, so familiar they had become part of the kitchen's natural rhythm, seemed to harmonize with the persistent warmth that rose from the stones, creating an atmosphere of such perfect peace that Elena felt she could work here forever, her hands shaping bread, while her mind wandered through the gentle landscape of memory and tradition. Now, as the gentle heat continued to rise from the stones around her, Elena understood that she had become the keeper of something larger than herself. Each fold of the dough connected her to a chain of women stretching back through time, all of them standing in warm kitchens, all of them preparing tomorrow's bread with the same careful attention she now brought to her work. The continuity of it filled her with a quiet satisfaction that went deeper than pride, deeper than mere competence. In the steady warmth that surrounded her, she felt herself to be part of an unbroken tradition, a link in a chain that stretched from the distant past into an unknowable future. The heat from the ovens seemed to pulse gently through the kitchen, creating currents of warm air that carried the mingled scents of yeast and flour, of wood smoke and the faint sweetness that lingered from the day's baking. Elena breathed deeply, allowing these familiar fragrances to fill her lungs, to become part of her in the way that the warmth had become part of the stones themselves. She thought of how her children would remember this kitchen, these evenings when the air was thick with heat and the promise of tomorrow's bread, when their mother's hands worked their quiet magic at the worn wooden table. From the next room came the soft murmur of her children's voices, their words indistinct, but their contentment clear in the gentle rise and fall of their conversation. The sound wove itself into the warm atmosphere of the kitchen, becoming part of the evening's rhythm, just as the heat from the ovens had become part of the room itself. Elena paused in her kneading to listen, her flour-dusted hands resting on the dough, and felt a moment of perfect alignment between past and present, between the work of her hands and the love that motivated it. The persistent warmth seemed to encourage contemplation, to slow time itself until each moment stretched like the dough beneath her palms, elastic and full of possibility. Elena found herself thinking about the nature of nourishment, how it extended beyond the simple provision of food to encompass the rituals and traditions that gave meaning to daily life. In this kitchen, warmed by stones that had absorbed decades of heat, she was not merely preparing bread, but participating in an act of communion that connected her family to the larger community, her present moment to the vast sweep of human history. As she shaped each loaf, Elena felt the dough's readiness in her fingertips, the subtle change in texture that indicated the gluten had developed properly, that the yeast was ready to begin its slow work of transformation. The gentle heat that surrounded her seemed to approve of her efforts, to bless each carefully formed round with the promise of perfect rising. She could almost see the bread as it would be in the morning, golden crusted and fragrant, ready to sustain her family through another day. The warmth seemed to pulse gently around her, carrying with it the memory of every loaf that had risen in this kitchen, every family that had been fed by bread shaped on this table. She thought of her own children, how they would someday remember this kitchen, these evenings when the stones breathed heat and their mother's hands worked magic from flour and water. The thought filled her with a tenderness that was almost overwhelming in its simplicity, a recognition that these quiet moments were perhaps the most important of all. In the gentle radiance that continued to emanate from the oven stones, Elena felt a deep connection to all the women who had ever kneaded dough, who had ever stood in warm kitchens preparing food for those they loved. The heat seemed to carry their presence, their accumulated wisdom and care, making her feel less alone in her work and more connected to the great chain of nurturing that stretched across cultures and centuries. As she resumed her work, Elena felt the dough reaching the perfect consistency beneath her palms. It had become smooth and elastic, ready for the long night's rest that would transform it into tomorrow's bread. She shaped it into rounds with practiced efficiency, each loaf receiving the same careful attention, the same gentle handling that would ensure its perfect rise. The persistent warmth of the kitchen seemed to approve of her work, wrapping around the shaped loaves like a blessing, like a promise that morning would bring fresh bread and the continuation of this ancient cycle of preparation and provision. She covered the loaves with clean linen, tucking the cloth around them with the same tenderness she had once used to tuck her children into their beds. The warmth of the kitchen would nurse them through the night, encouraging the slow miracle of fermentation that would make them ready for tomorrow's ovens. As she stepped back from the table, Elena felt the deep satisfaction that came from work well done, from duties faithfully performed in the endless cycle of feeding and caring that defined her days. The gentle heat, continued to rise from the stones, carrying with it the promise of tomorrow's fresh bread, the certainty that morning would find her here again, her hands once more transforming simple ingredients into sustenance. In this warm cocoon of kitchen and tradition, Elena allowed herself a moment of pure contentment, knowing that she was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do, her life woven seamlessly into the larger tapestry of family and community that gave meaning to each day's work. The ancient stones of the church held within them the accumulated prayers of centuries, and as Father Marcus moved through the nave in the evening light, he could feel this weight of devotion settling around him like a gentle presence. The massive walls seemed to breathe with the rhythm of countless vespers, their limestone surfaces worn smooth by the touch of faithful hands and the passage of time itself. In this atmosphere of stone and sanctity, where silence was not empty but full of unspoken communion, he found himself preparing for evening prayers with the same careful attention his predecessors had brought to this ritual for generations. The filtered light that entered through the stained glass windows cast patterns of blue and gold across the altar, transforming the familiar space into something that seemed to exist outside of ordinary time. Father Marcus moved through these pools of colored light with deliberate steps, his footfalls absorbed by the patient stones that had witnessed so many similar preparations. Each candle he lit added its small flame to the gathering dusk, creating islands of warmth in the cool vastness of the nave, and with each flame he felt the church awakening to its evening purpose. The stones beneath his feet seemed to hold not just the physical weight of the building, but the spiritual weight of all the prayers that had been offered within these walls. As he walked from altar to sacristy, from font to pulpit, Father Marcus could almost hear the echo of voices raised in hymn and supplication, the whispered confessions and fervent petitions that had filled this space with their urgent humanity. The walls had absorbed not only the heat of countless candles, but the warmth of human longing, the desire for connection with something greater than the small concerns of daily life. As he arranged the altar cloths with practiced precision, Father Marcus felt the familiar tension between his role as shepherd and his nature as man. The stone walls around him had heard the prayers of saints and sinners alike, had sheltered the faithful through plague and prosperity, war and peace. In their enduring presence, he found both comfort and challenge, for they reminded him that his own struggles were part of a larger tapestry, his doubts and certainties merely threads in a pattern too vast for any one person to comprehend. The evening light continued to fade beyond the windows, but the colors in the stained glass seemed to intensify as the sun dropped lower, casting deeper blues and more radiant golds across the stone floor. Father Marcus paused in his preparations to watch this daily transformation, this moment when the church seemed to glow from within, illuminated not by electric bulbs, but by the ancient collaboration between sunlight and colored glass. In this gentle radiance, he felt the presence of all those who had designed and built this sacred space, their faith made manifest in stone and glass, and the careful arrangement of light and shadow. The silence of the church was not the absence of sound, but rather its perfect distillation, a quietude so complete that it seemed to have substance and weight. In this profound stillness, Father Marcus could hear the whisper of his own breathing, the soft rustle of his vestments as he moved between altar and sacristy. These small sounds, rather than disturbing the peace, seemed to emphasize it, to make the silence more present and more profound. He thought of how many priests had moved through this same silence, had felt the same weight of responsibility and the same comfort of routine. The stones seemed to pulse with their own gentle rhythm, expanding and contracting almost imperceptibly as the day's heat slowly dissipated into the evening air. Father Marcus had learned to read these subtle signs, to understand that the church was not merely a building, but a living thing that responded to the cycles of day and night, season and weather, the ebb and flow of human presence and absence. In the quiet moments before Vespers, he could feel the building settling into its evening mood, preparing to receive the voices that would soon fill it with prayer and song. He paused before the crucifix, his hands clasped behind his back, and allowed his gaze to rest on the familiar figure carved in oak by some long-dead artisan. How many priests had stood in this exact spot, he wondered, looking up at this same face with the same mixture of faith and uncertainty that now filled his own heart? The stones beneath his feet had supported the weight of their questions, just as they now supported his, had absorbed their whispered prayers and private doubts with the same patient acceptance. The carved face seemed to change subtly in the shifting light, sometimes appearing to smile, sometimes to weep, sometimes to regard him with an expression of infinite compassion that brought tears to his own eyes. Father Marcus had long ago stopped trying to understand these moments of apparent animation, accepting them as part of the mystery that surrounded his calling, part of the inexplicable grace that occasionally broke through the routine of daily service to remind him why he had chosen this life. As he continued his preparations, Father Marcus found himself thinking about the nature of sanctuary, how this space had provided refuge not just from the physical dangers of the world, but from the spiritual uncertainties that plagued even the most faithful. The thick stone walls had sheltered generations of believers from doubt and despair, had offered them a place where their questions could be safely asked and their fears honestly acknowledged. In serving as guardian of this sanctuary, he felt himself to be part of something much larger than his individual ministry. The evening light continued to fade beyond the windows, but within the church, the candles he had lit created their own gentle illumination, pushing back the darkness without banishing it entirely. In this delicate balance between light and shadow, Father Marcus found himself thinking about the nature of faith itself, how it existed not in the bright certainty of noon, but in these liminal moments when day surrendered to night, when the visible world gave way to something larger and more mysterious. The stones around him seemed to exhale the day's accumulated warmth in gentle sighs that stirred the altar cloths and made the candle flames dance in their holders. Father Marcus breathed deeply, allowing the familiar sense of incense and old wood, of candle wax, and the indefinable fragrance of sanctity itself to fill his lungs and calm his mind. These were the smells of his childhood, of his calling, of the life he had chosen in service to something greater than himself. His congregation would arrive soon, their familiar faces appearing in the candlelight like flowers opening to the sun. He knew them all by name, knew their struggles and their joys, their private griefs and their small triumphs. In serving them, he served something larger than himself. Yet in their presence he was reminded of his own humanity, his own need for the comfort and community he offered to others. The stones had witnessed his growth from uncertain young priest to seasoned pastor, had absorbed his tears and his laughter, his moments of doubt and his experiences of grace. The church seemed to settle more deeply into its evening rhythm as the last light faded from the windows, the stones releasing their stored warmth in gentle currents that circulated through the nave like the breath of some vast benevolent presence. Father Marcus felt this warmth on his face and hands, felt it penetrating his vestments to touch his skin with the accumulated blessing of centuries of worship and devotion. The stones around him seemed to pulse with the accumulated faith of generations, each prayer adding its small weight to the vast foundation of belief that supported this place. Father Marcus felt himself to be both part of this continuity and separate from it, a temporary custodian of something eternal, a mortal man charged with tending to immortal truths. The responsibility of it might have been overwhelming if not for the patient presence of the stones themselves, which had outlasted so many before him and would outlast him as well. As he lit the final candle, Father Marcus allowed himself a moment of simple gratitude for this daily ritual, this opportunity to prepare sacred space for the evening's prayers. The church around him settled into its evening rhythm, the stones releasing the day's warmth in gentle exhalations that seemed almost like sighs of contentment. In this atmosphere of accumulated devotion and patient stone, he felt himself ready to welcome his flock, to lead them in the ancient words that connected them to something larger than their individual lives. The silence deepened around him, not empty but expectant, waiting for the voices that would soon fill it with song and prayer. Father Marcus straightened his shoulders and took his place at the altar, feeling the weight of tradition and the lightness of grace in equal measure, knowing that in this moment, in this place, surrounded by stones that had witnessed countless such moments, he was exactly where God intended him to be, ready to serve as bridge between the human and the divine. The forge breathed with a rhythm as old as metalwork itself, its bellows drawing air deep into the glowing heart of the coals before releasing it in gentle exhalations that kept the fire alive and eager for the work ahead. Willem stood beside his master in this atmosphere of controlled flame and patient heat, watching the iron rod emerge from the coals with the dull red glow that promised malleability. The workshop around them held the accumulated warmth of countless forgings, its brick walls and earthen floor storing heat like a living thing that pulsed with each stroke of the bellows. The rhythmic breathing of the forge created a hypnotic backdrop to their work, a sound so constant and familiar that Willem had learned to read its subtle variations, like a language. When the bellows drew in air, there was a moment of anticipation, a gathering of potential that preceded the gentle release of breath that fed the hungry flames. In this cycle of inhalation and exhalation, Willem found a meditation that calmed his mind and focused his attention on the work at hand. The iron sang its ancient song as Willem's hammer found its mark, each blow sending small showers of sparks dancing through the warm air like tiny stars being born and dying in the space of heartbeats. His master stood beside him, not speaking but present in the way that only comes from years of shared work, his weathered hands occasionally guiding Willem's grip or adjusting the angle of the metal against the anvil. In this gentle heat that rose from forge and floor alike, the old man's patience seemed as inexhaustible as the coals themselves. The workshop walls seemed to breathe with their own rhythm, expanding and contracting almost imperceptibly as they absorbed and released the heat from the forge. Willem had learned to read these subtle signs, to understand when the bricks had reached their optimal temperature for holding heat, when the very air in the workshop had become a living thing that supported and sustained their work. The accumulated warmth of years seemed to live in these walls, making the space feel less like a mere building and more like a sanctuary dedicated to the ancient art of shaping metal. Willem felt the iron yielding beneath his hammer, its molecular structure rearranging itself according to his will and the ancient laws of metallurgy. Each strike was both an act of creation and destruction, breaking down the metal's resistance while building something new and useful from its surrender. The steady warmth that surrounded them made the work feel timeless, as if he and his master existed in a pocket of eternity where iron had always been shaped by fire and human determination. The heat from the forge seemed to carry with it the essence of every piece that had ever been forged in this workshop, every tool and horseshoe, every nail and blade that had been shaped by hammers wielded by hands now long still. Willem could feel this history in the worn smoothness of the anvil's surface, in the practiced efficiency of his master's movements, in the way the very air seemed to vibrate with the accumulated knowledge of generations of smiths who had worked at this forge. As the bellows continued their patient breathing, Willem found himself falling into a trance-like state where his consciousness seemed to merge with the rhythm of the work. His hammer rose and fell with mechanical precision, yet each blow was guided by an intuition that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. The iron responded to this deeper knowing, yielding its secrets to hands that had learned to listen to the language of heated metal. The bellows continued their patient breathing, drawing fresh air into the forge's heart and releasing it in warm currents that circulated through the workshop like the circulation of blood through a body. Willem found himself falling into the rhythm of this breathing, his hammer strokes synchronized with the rise and fall of the leather lungs that kept their fire alive. In this coordination of breath and flame and metal, he felt himself becoming part of something larger than his individual effort. The workshop held within its heated atmosphere the accumulated wisdom of countless apprentices who had stood where Willem now stood, learning the same lessons from masters who had themselves once been young and uncertain. The warm air seemed to carry their presence, their struggles and triumphs, their gradual mastery of skills that could only be learned through patient repetition and careful observation. Willem felt connected to this invisible community of craftsmen, bound to them by the shared experience of learning to read iron's moods and respond to fire's demands. His master's eyes followed every movement of Willem's hands, reading the iron's temperature by its color, judging the proper moment for each fold and turn. The old man had spent decades learning to read metal like other men read books, and in the warm glow of the forge, his knowledge seemed to flow into Willem through observation and osmosis. There were no wasted words between them, no unnecessary instruction, only the patient transmission of skill from one generation to the next. The heat seemed to create its own weather system within the workshop, generating gentle currents of warm air that carried the scents of hot metal and burning coal, of oil and leather, and the indefinable fragrance of skilled work being performed with care and attention. Willem breathed deeply, allowing these familiar odors to fill his lungs and become part of him, marking him as surely as any formal ceremony might have done as a member of the ancient brotherhood of smiths. The workshop held the heat like a benediction, its walls radiating warmth that had been absorbed through years of daily firing. Willem thought of all the apprentices who had stood where he now stood, learning the same lessons from masters who had themselves once been young and uncertain, The continuity of it filled him with something approaching reverence, a recognition that he was part of an unbroken chain stretching back to the first human who had discovered that fire could make iron bend to human will. As the iron reached the perfect heat, Willem felt his master's subtle nod of approval, a gesture so slight that anyone else might have missed it entirely. But Willem had learned to read these small signs, to understand that praise from his master came not in words, but in the gradual increase of responsibility, the slow expansion of trust that marked his progress from novice to craftsman. The warm air seemed to carry this approval, to make it part of the workshop's atmosphere along with the heat and the rhythmic breathing of the forge. The steady warmth continued to rise from the forge, creating an atmosphere where time seemed to move differently, where the urgent concerns of the outside world faded before the immediate demands of iron and fire. Willem lost himself in the work, his consciousness narrowing to the feel of the hammer in his hand, the color of the metal, the rhythm of the bellows that kept their small universe of heat and creation alive. In this focused attention, he found a kind of peace that he had never experienced elsewhere. The heat from the forge seemed to penetrate not just his skin, but his very bones, warming him from the inside out, until he felt himself to be part of the fire itself, an extension of the ancient process that transformed raw ore into useful tools. His hammer became an extension of his arm an extension of his will aligned with the fundamental forces that governed the behavior of heated metal. In this alignment, he experienced moments of perfect clarity when the work seemed to do itself. When the piece was finished, Willem held it up to catch the light, examining the clean lines and smooth curves that his hammer had coaxed from the raw iron. His master took it in his scarred hands, testing its balance and strength with the quick efficiency of long experience. The slight smile that crossed the old man's face was worth more to Willem than any spoken praise, a recognition that he was indeed learning, that his hands were beginning to understand what his mind had long known. The gentle heat that continued to radiate from forge and walls seemed to bless their completed work, to approve of the transformation they had accomplished together. Willem felt a deep satisfaction settle into his bones, a contentment that came not from the completion of a single piece, but from the knowledge that he was mastering skills that would serve him for a lifetime, that he was becoming part of a tradition that stretched back through centuries of human ingenuity and perseverance. In the gentle heat that continued to radiate from forge and walls, Willem felt a deep satisfaction settle into his bones. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new pieces to shape and skills to master, but tonight he could rest in the knowledge that he had done good work, that his hammer had sung true, and his iron had yielded its secrets to his patient persistence. The workshop around him seemed to pulse with approval, its warm atmosphere embracing him like the blessing of generations of craftsmen who had walked this same path from apprentice to master. The soft whisper of thread through thread filled Margot's weaving room like a gentle conversation between silk and wool, a sound so constant and rhythmic that it had become part of the room's very atmosphere. Her shuttle moved through the warp with practiced grace, each pass creating another line in the growing cloth that stretched between the wooden arms of her loom. In this space where fiber became fabric through patient repetition, the continuous murmur of thread against thread provided a backdrop of such subtle beauty that Margot often forgot to notice it, like the sound of her own breathing or the beating of her heart. The candlelight flickered across the emerging pattern, revealing the complexity that grew beneath her hands one thread at a time. Margot had planned this piece through long winter evenings, sketching the design on precious paper and calculating the precise tension needed for each colored strand. Now, as her shuttle carried the weft through its predetermined path, she could see her vision taking shape in wool and linen, the abstract becoming concrete through the ancient alchemy of weaving. The loom itself seemed to breathe with each pass of the shuttle, its wooden frame creaking softly as Margot worked the pedals that lifted and lowered the heddles. This gentle percussion, combined with the constant whisper of moving thread, created a music that existed nowhere else, a sound that belonged entirely to this room and this work. In this atmosphere of textile and tradition, Margot felt herself connected to every woman who had ever sat at a loom, their shared knowledge flowing through her hands as naturally as the thread flowed through the warp. The spinning wheel in the corner stood ready for tomorrow's work, its wheel polished smooth by countless hours of use, its drive band supple with lanolin and care. Margot glanced at it occasionally as she worked, thinking of the fleece that waited to be transformed into yarn, the sheep that had grown the wool through patient seasons of grass and weather. The continuity of it pleased her, this chain of transformation that began in pastures and ended in cloth, each step requiring its own particular skill and patience. As the shuttle continued its rhythmic journey, Margot found her mind drifting to her sister Anna, who had married a merchant's son and moved to the city 2 summers past. Anna had written of fine shops and grand houses, of cloth so beautiful it seemed to glow with its own light. But Margot wondered if her sister missed this quieter beauty, this satisfaction that came from creating something useful and lasting with nothing but thread and time and the accumulated knowledge of generations. The soft susurrus of thread through thread seemed to carry memories with it, whispers of all the cloth that had been woven in this room before Margot inherited it from her aunt. The old woman had been a master weaver, her hands so skilled that merchants traveled from distant towns to commission her work. Margot still felt her presence sometimes in the evening light, still heard her voice in the gentle sound of the shuttle moving through the warp. The candle flame danced in a draught that touched nothing else, casting moving shadows across the growing cloth. In this play of light and darkness, Margot could see patterns within patterns, possibilities that existed only in the interplay of warp and weft, only in the moment when thread became something greater than the sum of its parts. The work demanded her complete attention, yet left her mind free to wander, a paradox that she had long ago ceased trying to understand. Each pass of the shuttle added weight to the cloth, literally and metaphorically. Margot could feel the fabric growing denser beneath her hands, could sense the moment when it would be ready to come off the loom and take its place in the world. Until then, it existed in a state of becoming, neither thread nor finished cloth, but something between, something that depended entirely on her continued patience and skill. The gentle whisper of thread through thread continued without pause, a sound so fundamental to the room that silence would have seemed unnatural. In this constant murmur, Margot heard the voice of her craft itself, the ancient conversation between human hands and natural fiber that had clothed humanity since the beginning of memory. She was part of this conversation now, her shuttle adding its voice to the eternal dialogue between necessity and beauty. As the evening deepened around her, Margot worked on in the gentle pool of candlelight, her hands moving with the unconscious grace of long practice. The cloth grew beneath her touch, row by patient row, each thread finding its proper place in the pattern she had conceived and was now bringing into being. In the soft atmosphere of whispered thread and flickering flame, she felt herself to be exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do. The colors in her cloth seemed to deepen as night approached, the blues becoming more profound, the greens more mysterious. Margot had chosen these particular shades after long consideration, remembering how her aunt had taught her that color was not merely decoration, but meaning made visible. The deep blue spoke of winter skies and distant water, while the green carried the memory of spring grass and new leaves. Between them, threads of cream and gold created pathways of light, channels for the eye to follow through the emerging landscape of her design. She paused occasionally to adjust the tension of a particular thread, her fingers reading the cloth's surface like a familiar text. These moments of stillness punctuated the rhythm of her work, brief interludes in which the constant whisper of thread through thread seemed to grow more pronounced, as if the loom itself were breathing more deeply. In these pauses, Margot became aware of the room around her, of the way the candlelight caught the grain of the wooden beams overhead, of the faint scent of wool and linseed oil that permeated everything. The cottage itself seemed to settle more deeply into the evening as she worked, its stone walls holding the day's warmth like a gentle embrace. Through the small window beside her loom, Margot could see the first stars appearing in the darkening sky, their distant light joining with her candle flame to illuminate the growing cloth. This connection between her small, contained world and the vast universe beyond gave her work a quality she could never quite name, a sense that each thread she wove was somehow part of a larger pattern that extended beyond her understanding. Her grandmother had once told her that weaving was prayer made visible, that each thread carried the weaver's intentions into the world. Margot had not understood then, but now, as her shuttle moved through its ancient dance, she felt the truth of those words in her hands and heart. The constant whisper of thread through thread became a kind of meditation, a practice that connected her not only to the cloth she was creating, but to something deeper and more enduring. The shadows in the room shifted as the candle burned lower, creating new patterns on the walls that seemed to echo the design emerging on her loom. Margot found herself thinking of the people who would eventually wear this cloth, wondering about their lives and dreams, their own daily rhythms and private hopes. In this way, her work became a bridge between strangers, a tangible connection that would outlast her own memory of creating it. As the night deepened around her cottage, the gentle susurrus of her craft continued without pause, a sound so integral to her being that she could imagine no world without it. The shuttle moved through the warp, with the inevitability of seasons changing, each pass adding another element to the slowly growing whole. In this atmosphere of thread and candlelight, of ancient skill and quiet devotion, Margot felt herself to be part of something timeless and essential, a keeper of traditions that stretched back beyond memory and forward into an unknowable future. The cloth beneath her hands held all of this, every thread a small act of faith, every row a testament to the patient accumulation of beauty. In the gentle whisper of thread through thread, in the soft creak of the loom's wooden frame, in the steady rhythm of her own breathing, Margot heard the quiet music of a life lived in harmony with its deepest purposes. The work would continue tomorrow, and the day after that, each session adding to the endless conversation between human hands and the materials they shaped into meaning. The oil lamp cast its steady glow across the wooden shelves of Aldrich's storehouse, its flame unwavering in the still air that held the mingled scents of wool and leather, distant spices, and the earthy smell of grain. The light moved gently with each small shift of the wick, creating shadows that danced softly across bolts of cloth from Flanders, sacks of barley from the northern counties, and barrels of ale that had traveled from monasteries where monks had perfected their craft over generations. In this quiet sanctuary of commerce, where the accumulated wealth of careful trading rested in ordered rows, Aldrich moved with the measured pace of a man who had learned to find satisfaction in the tangible weight of prosperity. He paused before a bolt of deep blue wool, running his fingers along its edge where the weave caught the lamplight. The cloth had come from merchants who spoke of cities beyond the mountains, of markets where different languages mingled in the pursuit of profit, of ships that carried goods across waters he had never seen. Each item in his storehouse represented a connection to that wider world, a thread in the vast web of trade that stretched from his small village to places whose names he knew only from the lips of traveling merchants. The satisfaction he felt was not merely in the possession of these goods, but in his understanding of their origins, their journey to his hands, their eventual destination in the homes of his neighbors. The ledger lay open on his wooden table, its pages filled with his careful script, documenting each transaction, each arrival, each sale. The ink had dried to a deep brown, and the parchment bore the slight impressions of his pen where he had pressed too firmly in his concentration. He had always taken pride in the precision of his records, in the way each entry told the story of goods moved from one place to another, of needs met and desires fulfilled. Tonight, as he reviewed the day's work, he found himself pausing longer than usual over certain entries, as if the familiar words held meanings he had not previously considered. The flame of the lamp flickered slightly, though no wind disturbed the air of the storehouse. In that brief moment of wavering light, Aldrich felt something he could not name, a sense that the ordered world he had constructed around himself might be less permanent than he had believed. The feeling passed quickly, but it left behind a residue of unease that settled into his thoughts like sediment in still water. He had built his prosperity through careful attention to the patterns of trade, to the seasonal rhythms of supply and demand, to the reliable needs of his community. Yet something in the quality of recent conversations with visiting merchants had suggested that these patterns might be shifting in ways he did not yet understand. He moved to a barrel of wine that had arrived only days before, its wooden staves still bearing the marks of its journey. The merchant who had delivered it had spoken of delays in the eastern ports, of ships that had been turned away from harbors where they had once been welcomed. There had been something in the man's manner that suggested these were not merely the usual complications of trade, but something more fundamental, though he had offered no explanation beyond vague references to troubles in distant cities. Aldrich had accepted the wine and paid the agreed price, but the conversation had left him with questions he could not articulate. The storehouse held the accumulated evidence of his life's work, each item carefully chosen and acquired through negotiations that had required patience, judgment, and an understanding of human nature. He had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when a merchant was desperate to sell, when a customer was prepared to pay a premium, when the time was right to hold goods back in anticipation of increased demand. This knowledge had served him well, allowing him to provide for his family while building a reputation for fair dealing that extended beyond the boundaries of his village. Yet tonight, as he stood among his possessions in the gentle light of the oil lamp, Aldrich found himself thinking not of future profits, but of the fragility of the connections that made his livelihood possible. The cloth from Flanders depended on the continued prosperity of weavers he would never meet. The spices from distant lands required the cooperation of merchants, ship captains, and port officials whose decisions could affect his business in ways he might never fully understand. The very coins in his strongbox bore the images of rulers whose policies could shift the currents of trade as surely as storms could alter the course of ships. He returned to his ledger and began the evening's accounting, his pen moving steadily across the parchment as he recorded the day's transactions. The familiar ritual brought him comfort, the certainty of numbers and the satisfaction of balanced accounts. Each entry represented not merely a commercial exchange, but a moment of human connection, a meeting of needs that had benefited both parties. This was the foundation of his prosperity, the understanding that trade at its best served the common good while rewarding those who facilitated the movement of goods from where they were abundant to where they were needed. The oil in the lamp burned with a steady consistency, its light revealing the careful organization of his storehouse. Every item had its place, every place its purpose. This order was not merely practical, but reflected his belief that commerce, properly conducted, was a form of stewardship, a way of ensuring that the products of human labor found their way to those who could make best use of them. He had seen merchants who treated their goods as mere objects to be moved for profit, but he had always understood that each item carried with it the skill and effort of those who had created it. As the evening deepened around his storehouse, Aldrich found himself drawn to a small collection of items that had arrived with the most recent caravan from the south. Among them was a piece of silk so fine it seemed to capture and hold the lamplight, its surface shimmering with colors that shifted as he moved it in his hands. The merchant who had sold it to him had spoken of the skilled artisans who had created it, of techniques passed down through generations, of the patience required to transform the cocoons of silkworms into something of such beauty. Holding the silk, Aldrich felt a connection to those distant craftsmen, to the long chain of hands through which this piece had passed before reaching his storehouse. Tomorrow he would offer it to one of the village's more prosperous families, perhaps for a wedding dress or a ceremonial garment, and it would begin another phase of its journey. The thought filled him with the satisfaction that came from knowing his role in this process, from understanding that his work as a merchant served purposes beyond his own enrichment. The flame of the oil lamp continued its steady burning, casting its warm light over the ordered rows of goods that represented Aldrich's life's work. In this quiet space, surrounded by the fruits of careful trading and patient accumulation, he felt the deep contentment that came from a day well spent and work well done. Yet beneath this satisfaction, like a current running beneath the surface of a calm river, was the growing awareness that the world beyond his village was changing in ways that might soon touch even this peaceful corner of existence. For now, though, there was only the gentle light, the familiar sense of his goods, and the quiet pride of a man who had built something lasting in an uncertain world. The weight of dough. Elena's hands found the dough before her mind fully awakened, fingers pressing into the yielding mass with the certainty of 20 years' practice. The kitchen held yesterday's warmth, mixing with the cool morning air that seeped through wooden shutters like a gentle whisper. She worked in the pre-dawn darkness, guided by touch alone, feeling the dough respond to her pressure like something alive and trusting. Flour dust danced in the first pale beams of sunlight, creating a soft haze that transformed her familiar workspace into something almost sacred. The wooden table bore the marks of countless kneadings, its surface worn smooth by generations of bakers who had stood in this same spot, performing this same ritual. Elena's grandmother had taught her mother here, and her mother had taught her, each woman passing down not just technique, but something deeper, something that lived in the rhythm of fold and turn. The dough spoke to her in ways words never could, too dry, and it would crack under pressure, too wet, and it would lose its shape, becoming formless and disappointing. But when it was right, when the balance was perfect, it became pliable and strong, ready to rise and transform. Elena understood that she was not merely mixing ingredients, but participating in an ancient conversation between human hands and the gifts of earth and grain. She thought of the villagers who would break this bread tomorrow, how it would nourish Willem as he worked at the forge, how it would comfort Margot during her long hours at the loom. Father Marcus would bless it during communion, transforming her simple creation into something holy. The bread connected them all, thread by thread, meal by meal, sustaining the invisible bonds that held their small community together. The rhythm settled into her bones like a meditation. Press, fold, turn. Press, fold, turn. Her mother's hands had moved in this same pattern, her grandmother's hands before that. Elena felt them with her now, their knowledge flowing through her fingers, their love kneaded into every loaf. This was her prayer, her offering to the village that depended on her steady presence. Clay bowls sat in perfect order around her workspace, each one placed with the precision of ritual. The measuring cups, the wooden spoons, the linen cloths, all of it arranged exactly as her mother had taught her. There was comfort in this order, in the certainty that some things remained constant even as seasons changed and people aged. The bakery was more than a business. It was a sanctuary where the most basic human need was transformed into an act of love. The air carried the ghost of yesterday's bread, yeast, and grain, and the comfort of home-baked sustenance. Elena breathed it in, letting it fill her lungs like incense. She had never thought of herself as particularly religious, but standing here in the early morning light, her hands deep in dough, she felt closer to the divine than she ever did sitting in Father Marcus's pews. The dough began to change under her touch, becoming smoother, more elastic. She could feel the gluten forming, the proteins aligning to create structure and strength. It was a small miracle that happened every morning, this transformation from separate ingredients into something greater than the sum of its parts. Elena marveled at how flour and water and salt could become sustenance, how her simple actions could feed an entire village. She worked without hurry, letting the dough teach her patience. There was no rushing this process, no shortcuts that wouldn't compromise the final result. The bread would rise in its own time, bake when it was ready, emerge from the oven golden and perfect only if she honored every step along the way. It was a lesson in trust, in faith, in the wisdom of accepting what could not be hurried. Sunlight grew stronger, painting the flour-dusted surfaces with gold. Elena could hear the village beginning to stir, a rooster crowing in the distance, the soft murmur of voices from the house next door. Soon, people would begin their daily routines, and her bread would be part of that rhythm, nourishing them for whatever the day might bring. She shaped the dough into portions, each one destined to become a loaf that would grace someone's table. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, but her heart was full of something deeper than mere skill. This was her contribution to the continuity of village life, her way of saying that tomorrow would come, that there would be bread and warmth, and the simple comfort of knowing that some needs would always be met. The weight of the dough in her hands felt like the weight of responsibility, but it was a burden she carried gladly. Elena understood now that her work was not just about baking bread, but about maintaining the rhythms that kept their small world turning. Each loaf was a promise, a commitment to the future, a quiet declaration that life would continue, sustained by the ancient partnership between human hands and the gifts of the earth. As the morning light strengthened, Elena found herself thinking of the countless women who had stood in kitchens like this one, their hands working dough while their minds wandered through the complexities of daily life. There was something profoundly connecting about this shared experience across generations, this common thread of nourishing others through the simple act of baking bread. She wondered if her grandmother had felt this same sense of purpose, this quiet satisfaction that came from knowing her work mattered in ways both practical and profound. The kitchen began to warm as the sun climbed higher, and Elena could smell the faint sweetness of yeast beginning to work in yesterday's loaves. The scent mingled with the flour dust and the clean morning air, creating an atmosphere that spoke of home and comfort, and the eternal cycle of preparation and sustenance. She had grown up with these smells, had learned to associate them with safety and love, and the reliable presence of someone who cared enough to rise before dawn to ensure that bread would be waiting. Her movements became more fluid as the dough reached the perfect consistency, responding to her touch with an almost eager compliance. Elena could feel the life in it now, the potential for transformation that lay dormant in the simple mixture of flour and water and salt. This was the moment she treasured most, when the dough became truly alive under her hands, when she could sense its readiness to become something greater than its humble origins. The wooden shutters creaked softly in the morning breeze, allowing more light to filter into the kitchen and illuminate the fine particles of flour that hung suspended in the air like tiny stars. Elena paused in her work to watch them drift and settle, marveling at how even the dust in her kitchen seemed to participate in the quiet beauty of the morning ritual. Everything had its place in this gentle choreography of bread making, from the largest gesture to the smallest detail. She thought of the children who would eat this bread, how it would fuel their games and studies and dreams. She imagined the elderly villagers breaking it carefully with arthritic hands, savoring each bite with the appreciation that comes from understanding how precious such simple pleasures truly are. The bread would become part of their bodies, their strength, their ability to face another day with hope and purpose. In this way, Elena's work extended far beyond the boundaries of her kitchen, touching lives in ways both seen and unseen. The dough rested now in its bowls, covered with clean linen cloths that her mother had embroidered with simple patterns of wheat and vine. Elena arranged them with the same care she brought to every aspect of her craft, ensuring that each portion had the space and conditions it needed to rise properly. This waiting period was as important as the active work, a time when patience and faith combined to create the conditions for transformation. As she cleaned her workspace, Elena felt the deep satisfaction that came from work well done, from participating in an ancient tradition that connected her to countless generations of bakers who had understood the sacred nature of their calling. The kitchen settled into its daytime rhythm, ready for the next phase of the bread-making process, while outside the village awakened to another day sustained by the quiet dedication of those who rose early to serve their community's most basic needs. The language of metal. Willem held the red-hot iron with tongs, feeling the heat radiate against his face like a living presence. The metal glowed with inner fire, pulsing between orange and deep red as he studied its readiness. His master watched from the corner of the forge, saying nothing, but Willem sensed approval in the older man's stillness. The horseshoe he was shaping would be his finest work yet, each curve and angle speaking of growing confidence and understanding. The forge glowed with steady heat, its red heart pulsing like something alive and breathing. Sparks rose and faded in lazy arcs, each one carrying a moment of light before dissolving into shadow. Willem had learned to read these sparks, to understand what they told him about the metal's temperature and readiness. They were like a language he was finally beginning to speak fluently, after months of fumbling with unfamiliar words. He positioned the iron on the anvil and raised his hammer. The first strike rang out clear and true, a deep musical note that resonated through the stone walls and wooden beams. The sound had changed over the weeks of his apprenticeship. Where once his blows had been tentative and uncertain, now they carried intention and purpose. Each strike of the hammer was a conversation between his will and the metal's nature, a negotiation rather than a battle. The bellows breathed with mechanical rhythm behind him, feeding air to the hungry flames. Willem had spent countless hours working those bellows, building the strength in his arms and shoulders, learning to read the fire's needs. Now the rhythm was second nature, part of the forge's heartbeat that matched his own pulse. The fire was no longer his enemy, but his partner, transforming raw metal into something useful and beautiful. Sunlight streamed through the wide opening of the forge, creating a golden path across the packed earth floor. Dust motes danced in the light, mixing with the sparks and smoke to create an atmosphere that seemed charged with possibility. Willem felt the weight of tradition in this space, the knowledge that countless smiths had stood where he stood, learning the same lessons, mastering the same ancient craft. Tools hung in perfect order along the walls, each one worn smooth by countless hands. His master had taught him to respect these tools, to clean and maintain them as carefully as he would tend a living thing. They were extensions of the smith's hands and will, each one designed for a specific purpose, shaped by generations of craftsmen who understood the intimate relationship between tool and task. The horseshoe began to take shape under his hammer, each blow bending the metal closer to its final form. Willem could see the finished product in his mind now, could anticipate how the metal would respond to his touch. This was the breakthrough he had been working toward, the moment when technique became instinct, when the craft began to flow through him rather than around him. He moved the iron back to the fire, watching the metal drink in the heat until it glowed with renewed life. The timing was crucial. Too long in the fire and the metal would burn, too little and it would be too hard to shape. Willem had learned to read these subtle differences, to understand the metal's moods and needs. It was like learning to speak with an old friend, one who communicated through color and temperature rather than words. The anvil rang again as he resumed his work, each strike more confident than the last. Willem felt his master's eyes on him, but the older man's presence no longer made him nervous. Instead, it felt like a blessing, a recognition that knowledge was being passed from one generation to the next. The master had been patient with his fumbling early attempts, had guided him through the frustrations and setbacks that came with learning any complex skill. Sweat beaded on Willem's forehead despite the morning coolness. The work was physical, demanding strength and endurance, but it was also deeply satisfying. There was something primal about shaping metal with fire and hammer, something that connected him to the most basic human need to create and transform. He was not just making a horseshoe, but participating in an ancient tradition that stretched back to the first smith who discovered that metal could be bent to human will. The curve of the shoe grew more pronounced with each blow, following the natural arc that would fit a horse's hoof perfectly. Willem had learned to see this curve in his mind before he began, to understand how the flat bar of iron would transform into something functional and necessary. It was a kind of vision, an ability to see potential in raw materials that came only with experience and dedication. His hammer found its rhythm, striking in steady intervals that created a percussion like music. The sound echoed off the stone walls and wooden beams, joining with the whisper of the bellows and the soft roar of the fire to create the forge's unique symphony. Willem had grown to love these sounds, to find comfort in their familiar patterns. They spoke of productivity and purpose, of ancient skills being practiced with care and precision. The horseshoe neared completion, its shape now unmistakably correct. Willem held it up to examine his work, turning it in the light to check for flaws or imperfections. The metal had responded to his touch like a willing partner, bending and shaping according to his vision. He felt a quiet pride in the work, not the boastful satisfaction of showing off, but the deeper contentment that came from knowing he had done something well. His master approached and took the horseshoe, examining it with the critical eye of long experience. Willem waited, his heart beating faster despite his growing confidence. The older man's approval still mattered, still carried the weight of validation and acceptance. When his master nodded and handed the shoe back with a small smile, Willem felt something shift inside him, a recognition that he was no longer just an apprentice, fumbling with unfamiliar tools, but a craftsman in his own right, worthy of the ancient tradition he was learning to carry forward. The forge continued its eternal breathing around them, the bellows maintaining their steady rhythm while the fire consumed its fuel with patient hunger. Willem understood now that this sound would become the soundtrack of his working life, as familiar and comforting as his own heartbeat. He had found his place in the long chain of craftsmen who had kept this ancient skill alive, who had understood that working with metal was both a practical necessity and a form of prayer. He set the finished horseshoe aside to cool and selected another bar of iron from the pile beside the forge. The metal was cold and dark, showing no hint of the glowing potential that lay dormant within it. Willem smiled as he thrust it into the fire, watching it begin to change color as the heat penetrated its surface. This transformation never ceased to amaze him, the way something so hard and unyielding could become soft and malleable when treated with the right combination of heat and patience. The morning light shifted as clouds moved across the sun, changing the quality of illumination that fell across his workspace. Willem had learned to work in all kinds of light, to judge the metal's readiness by color and feel rather than relying solely on vision. His hands had developed their own wisdom, able to sense the subtle changes in temperature and texture that indicated when the iron was ready to be shaped. He thought of the village beyond the forge walls, of the horses that would wear the shoes he made, of the farmers and merchants whose livelihoods depended on reliable transportation. His work connected him to this larger community in ways he was only beginning to understand. Each horseshoe was a small but essential part of the village's economic life, enabling the movement of goods and people that kept their small world functioning. The steady percussion of hammer on anvil resumed as Willem began shaping the new piece of iron. The sound had become as natural to him as breathing, a rhythm that seemed to align with the deeper patterns of work and rest that governed all life. In this moment, surrounded by the familiar sounds and smells of the forge, Willem felt completely at peace with his chosen path, confident that he had found not just a trade, but a calling that would sustain him for the rest of his working life. Threads of memory. Margot's fingers moved across the warp threads with practiced ease, but today she saw something different in the pattern emerging under her hands. The afternoon light streamed through her weaving room window, transforming the hanging threads into streams of gold and amber that seemed to pulse with their own inner life. Each strand caught the light differently, creating a tapestry of color and shadow that spoke to her in ways she had never noticed before. The loom stood solid and patient before her, its wooden frame worn smooth by years of use. Margot had inherited it from her mother, who had received it from her grandmother, and she could feel the presence of those women in the steady rhythm of her work. Their hands had moved across these same threads, had created patterns that warmed their families and brought beauty into their simple lives. The continuity was both comforting and humbling, a reminder that she was part of something larger than herself. She reached for a thread of deep brown wool, the color of good earth and fresh bread, and thought immediately of Elena. The baker's steady presence in the village was like this thread, reliable, nourishing, essential to the pattern of their daily lives. Margot wove it into her design, feeling the rightness of its placement, the way it anchored the other colors and gave them context and meaning. Next came a bright red thread, vibrant as forge fire, and Willem's eager face appeared in her mind. The young apprentice was like this color, intense, full of energy, sometimes overwhelming, but always vital. She placed it carefully, allowing it to contrast with the brown while still harmonizing with the overall design. The threads seemed to speak to each other, creating relationships that mirrored the connections between the people they represented. Baskets of wool and linen threads sat arranged by color around her workspace, creating a rainbow of possibility. Margot had spent years collecting and preparing these materials, dyeing them with plants from the surrounding countryside, spinning them on her wheel during the long winter evenings. Each thread carried memories of its creation, of the plants that gave it color, of the sheep whose wool provided its substance. The steady click of the shuttle moving back and forth created a gentle percussion that seemed to match her heartbeat. Margot had always found this rhythm soothing, but today it felt like something more, a meditation, a prayer woven into the fabric of time itself. The soft whisper of thread against thread added a subtle harmony, creating the unique music of the loom that had accompanied her thoughts for so many years. She chose a thread of deep blue, rich as evening sky, and thought of Father Marcus. The priest's quiet wisdom and steady faith were like this color, deep, calming, providing a sense of peace and continuity that the village depended upon. Margot wove it into the pattern, watching how it interacted with the other colors, how it brought out their best qualities while maintaining its own distinct character. Dust motes drifted lazily through the afternoon air, caught in the slanted sunbeams, like tiny dancers celebrating the act of creation. Margot paused in her work to watch them, marveling at how they moved without purpose, yet created something beautiful in their random patterns. It reminded her of village life itself, individual actions that seemed small and insignificant, but combined to create something larger and more meaningful. The pattern beneath her hands began to reveal itself more clearly. What had started as separate threads was becoming a unified whole, each color playing its part in a design that was greater than any single element. Margot realized she had been weaving the village itself, thread by thread, creating a record of the invisible bonds that held them all together. The brown of Elena's steadiness, the red of Willem's enthusiasm, the blue of Father Marcus's faith, all of it coming together to create something beautiful and strong. She thought of the conversations she had shared with these people, the moments of joy and sorrow that had woven their lives together. Elena bringing fresh bread to her door during her illness last winter, Willem's eager questions about the patterns in her cloth, Father Marcus's gentle counsel during her moments of doubt. These memories were like threads themselves, creating a fabric of relationship and care that sustained them all. The weaving room filled with honey-colored light as the afternoon progressed, casting everything in a warm glow that made the simplest objects seem precious. Margot's wooden shuttle gleamed like polished gold, the threads shimmered like jewels, and even the worn floorboards seemed to pulse with inner life. She had always loved this time of day, when the light was soft and forgiving, when the world seemed to slow down and reveal its hidden beauty. Her fingers found their rhythm again, pulling the shuttle through the warp threads with movements that had become as natural as breathing. Each pass created another row in the pattern, another layer in the story she was telling through color and texture. Margot understood now that weaving was not just about creating cloth, but about connecting disparate elements into a unified whole, about finding the patterns that linked all things together. The loom creaked softly as she worked, a sound so familiar it had become part of the background music of her life. But today she heard it differently, as if the wooden frame itself was singing, celebrating the transformation taking place beneath her hands. The threads were no longer separate strands, but part of something larger, something that would outlast any single thread while honoring the contribution of each one. She paused to examine her work, running her fingers across the emerging pattern. The texture was perfect, the tension even, the colors blending and contrasting in ways that pleased her eye and satisfied her sense of rightness. This would be her finest piece, she realized, not because of its technical perfection, but because of the love and understanding she had woven into every thread. Margot smiled as she resumed her work, feeling connected not just to the threads beneath her hands, but to the entire web of relationships that made up her world. Each person in the village was like a thread in this larger tapestry, essential to the pattern, irreplaceable in their unique contribution to the whole. She was weaving more than cloth. She was creating a celebration of community, a testament to the beauty that emerged when individual lives were woven together with care and intention. The afternoon light began to shift as the sun moved lower in the sky, casting longer shadows across her workspace and deepening the colors of her threads. Margot had learned to work with these changing conditions, to understand how different qualities of light revealed different aspects of her work. The golden hour brought out the warmth in her colors, while the cooler light of morning emphasized their clarity and definition. She selected a thread of soft green, the color of new leaves and spring grass, and thought of the children in the village. Their laughter and energy were like this color, fresh, hopeful, full of the promise of growth and change. As she wove it into the pattern, Margot felt a deep sense of continuity, knowing that these children would grow up to become the next generation of bakers and smiths and weavers, carrying forward the traditions that gave their community its strength and identity. The shuttle continued its patient journey back and forth across the loom, each pass adding another element to the growing design. Margot had learned to trust this process, to allow the pattern to emerge organically rather than forcing it to conform to some predetermined vision. The cloth was teaching her as much as she was creating it, revealing connections and possibilities that she might never have discovered through planning alone. As the afternoon wore on, Margot found herself thinking about the nature of memory itself, how it was like the warp threads that ran the length of her cloth, providing the foundation upon which all other elements were built. The memories of her mother and grandmother, of the countless hours spent learning the craft, of the quiet satisfaction that came from creating something beautiful with her own hands. All of these formed the invisible structure that supported her work and gave it meaning. The weaving room settled into its familiar evening rhythm as the light began to fade, the colors of the threads becoming richer and more mysterious in the gathering dusk. Margot worked by feel now as much as by sight, her fingers reading the texture and tension of each thread, her hands moving with the confidence that came from years of practice. This was when she felt most connected to the generations of women who had worked at looms like this one, their hands guided by the same accumulated wisdom that now flowed through her own movements. She thought of the finished cloth and how it would be used, perhaps as a blanket to warm a family during the cold winter months, or as a wall hanging to bring color and beauty into someone's home. The threads she was weaving today would become part of other people's stories, would witness their joys and sorrows, would provide comfort and pleasure long after she had forgotten the specific afternoon when she created them. In this way, her work extended far beyond the boundaries of her own life, touching the future in ways both practical and profound. The weight of silence. Father Marcus moved through the church in the gathering dusk, lighting candles one by one. Each flame seemed to carry the prayers of his parishioners, their hopes and fears made visible in the dancing light. The familiar ritual brought him comfort, but tonight it also carried the weight of responsibility that had grown heavier with each passing year. He was no longer the young priest who had arrived in this village full of certainty and zeal, but a man who had learned that faith was as much about questions as answers. The church settled into evening quiet, its stone walls holding the day's warmth like a gentle embrace. These walls had witnessed countless prayers, confessions, celebrations, and sorrows. They had sheltered generations of villagers through their most sacred moments, and Father Marcus felt humbled to be their temporary guardian. The stones themselves seemed to pulse with accumulated faith, with the devotion of all who had knelt here before him. Candles flickered in their holders, casting dancing shadows that seemed to breathe with life. Father Marcus had always found something mystical in candlelight, the way it transformed the familiar church into something ethereal and mysterious. The flames reminded him that faith itself was like this, fragile, yet persistent, small, yet capable of illuminating the darkness, requiring constant tending, yet offering warmth and guidance to all who approached. He thought of Elena, kneading her bread in the pre-dawn darkness, and wondered if she found God in the rhythm of her work. There was something sacred in her devotion to feeding the village, something that spoke of service and love more eloquently than many sermons. Father Marcus had learned to see the divine in such simple acts, to recognize that holiness often wore the humble garments of daily work rather than the elaborate vestments of ceremony. The wooden pews gleamed softly in the candlelight, worn smooth by generations of worshippers. Each one held memories of the people who had occupied it, families celebrating baptisms and marriages, individuals seeking comfort in times of loss, the entire community gathering for the great festivals that marked the passage of time. Father Marcus could almost see them all, the living and the dead, united in their shared search for meaning and connection. Stained glass windows glowed like jewels in the fading light, their colors muted but still beautiful. During the day they cast brilliant patterns across the floor and walls, but in the evening they became more subtle, their beauty revealed in gentle gradations of color that seemed to whisper rather than shout. Father Marcus had spent many hours contemplating these windows, finding in their artistry a reflection of how divine truth often came not in blinding revelation, but in quiet moments of recognition and grace. The air carried the scent of beeswax and old wood, incense, and the faint perfume of wildflowers left at the altar. These smells had become as familiar to him as his own breathing, creating an atmosphere that spoke of reverence and continuity. He breathed deeply, letting the familiar scents ground him in the present moment, while connecting him to all the services, all the prayers, all the sacred moments that had filled this space with meaning. He knelt before the altar, feeling the weight of every confession he had heard, every blessing he had given, every moment when he had stood between his people and the mystery of God's will. The responsibility was immense, but so was the privilege, to be trusted with people's deepest fears and highest hopes, to offer comfort in times of sorrow and celebration in times of joy. It was both humbling and terrifying. Every sound seemed magnified in the sacred silence, the soft whisper of his robes, the gentle creak of kneeling boards, the distant murmur of wind through the eaves. Father Marcus had learned to listen to this silence, to find in it not emptiness but fullness, not absence but presence. The quiet held all the prayers that had ever been offered here, all the faith that had ever been expressed within these walls. He thought of Willem at the forge, learning to shape metal with fire and hammer, and saw in the young man's journey a reflection of spiritual growth. Faith, too, required patience and practice, the willingness to be shaped by forces greater than oneself. The apprentice's growing skill reminded Father Marcus that spiritual maturity came not through sudden revelation, but through daily practice, through the gradual alignment of will and purpose. Margot's weaving came to mind, the way she created beauty by bringing separate threads together into a unified pattern. The church was like that loom, Father Marcus realized, a place where individual lives were woven together into something larger and more beautiful than any single strand. His role was not to create the pattern, but to tend the loom, to ensure that the weaving continued, that the community remained connected by bonds stronger than mere proximity. The familiar words of evening prayer formed on his lips, but tonight they felt both heavy and light, heavy with responsibility, light with the grace he hoped flowed through him despite his doubts. He had learned that doubt was not the enemy of faith, but its companion, that the questions that kept him awake at night were not signs of weakness, but evidence of the seriousness with which he approached his calling. As he prepared for the evening service, Father Marcus felt the presence of all who would join him in prayer. Elena would come, her hands still dusted with flour, her heart full of the quiet satisfaction of work well done. Willem might appear, eager and uncertain, seeking guidance for the questions that came with growing up. Margot would be there, her fingers still moving in the rhythm of the loom, her eyes bright with the understanding that came from creating beauty. The evening light continued to fade, and with it came a deeper sense of the church's ancient presence. Father Marcus found himself thinking of all the priests who had stood where he now stood, who had lit these same candles and spoken these same prayers. There was comfort in this continuity, in knowing that his doubts and certainties were part of a long tradition of men who had wrestled with the divine mystery and found themselves both humbled and elevated by the encounter. He moved to adjust the flowers on the altar, their petals soft beneath his fingers. Someone had brought them this morning. Perhaps old Mrs. Brennan, who tended her garden with the same devotion she brought to her prayers. The flowers would wilt and be replaced, just as the candles would burn down and be renewed, just as the seasons would turn and the congregation would change. Yet something endured in this cycle of renewal, something that spoke to the persistence of hope even in the face of mortality. The stone floor beneath his feet had been worn smooth by countless pilgrims, countless seekers who had come here carrying their burdens and their dreams. Father Marcus felt connected to them all, part of an unbroken chain of human longing that stretched back through the centuries. In moments like this, the weight of his calling felt less like a burden and more like a privilege, a chance to participate in something far greater than his individual understanding. He thought of the confessions he had heard over the years, the way people came to him with their secrets and their shame, seeking absolution or simply the comfort of being heard. Each story had taught him something about the human heart, about the universal struggles that connected all people regardless of their circumstances. In the darkness of the confessional, he had learned that everyone carried wounds, everyone sought forgiveness, everyone yearned for connection and meaning. The candles burned steadily, their light pushing back the gathering darkness without conquering it entirely. Father Marcus understood that this was perhaps the most honest metaphor for faith, not a blazing sun that eliminated all shadow, but a gentle flame that provided enough light for the next step, enough warmth for the present moment. In the end, perhaps that was all any of them could offer. Not answers to every question, but presence in the face of mystery, community in the midst of uncertainty, and the quiet assurance that none of them walked their path alone. As he stood in the gathering twilight, surrounded by the familiar embrace of stone and candlelight, Father Marcus felt a deep gratitude for this place and these people who had shaped his understanding of what it meant to serve. The church held them all, the living and the dead, the faithful and the doubting, the certain and the searching, in its ancient arms, offering not answers but sanctuary, not solutions but the promise that no one need face the darkness entirely alone. The lamp flame held steady in the counting room, its light falling across the open ledger where Aldrich's careful script recorded the day's final transactions. The numbers marched down the page in neat columns, each entry a small decision made, a need met, a connection forged between one person and another. He dipped his quill and added the last notation, the sale of fine thread to Margot for the mayor's daughter's wedding dress, then set the pen aside and leaned back in his chair. The wooden desk bore the accumulated marks of 20 years in trade, small ink stains, and scratches that told their own stories of late nights spent balancing accounts, of contracts signed and bargains struck. His fingers traced one particular groove, worn smooth by his habit of running his thumb along the edge when deep in thought. How many evenings had he spent here, tallying profits and planning purchases, believing that the true measure of his life lay in the steady accumulation of coins in his strongbox. But tonight, the ledger seemed to speak in a different language. The entry for grain sold to Elena during the harsh winter months no longer represented merely a transaction, but a moment when he had helped sustain a family through difficult times. The iron purchased by Willem's master for spring plowing spoke of hope, of faith in future harvests, of the eternal cycle that bound the village together in shared purpose. Each notation mapped not just the flow of goods, but the rhythm of life itself, the way human needs and desires moved through the community like water finding its level. He turned back several pages, reading entries from the previous autumn. Here was the record of wool sold to the weaver's wife for winter cloaks. There, the notation of salt purchased for preserving meat before the cold months. The numbers told the story of preparation, of a community working together to survive and thrive. His role in this dance of commerce had never been about the goods themselves, but about the spaces between people, the trust that allowed one person to provide what another needed. The shelves around him held samples of his trade, small portions of grain and spice, lengths of cloth and coils of rope. Each item had traveled far to reach this room, carried by merchants and traders who formed an invisible network spanning continents. But their true journey began when they left his hands, when they became part of someone's daily life, woven into the fabric of the village's existence. The fine silk that would become a wedding dress, the iron that would turn soil for planting, the salt that would preserve the winter's meat. A soft sound from the street drew his attention to the window. A young couple walked past, their voices low and intimate in the evening air. He recognized them as the baker's apprentice and the chandler's daughter, recently betrothed and planning their own wedding for the coming spring. In his ledger he would find records of their purchases, the special flour for wedding cakes, the finest candles for their ceremony. But the numbers could not capture the joy in their voices, the way their hands found each other in the darkness, the dreams they carried like precious cargo. This was what his years in commerce had truly accomplished, he realized, not the accumulation of wealth, though that had come, but the weaving of connections, the creation of a web of relationships that held the community together. Every transaction had been a small act of faith, a belief that what one person had could serve another's need, that the exchange of goods was really the exchange of care, of attention to the details that made life possible. The lamp flame flickered slightly as a draft moved through the room, then steadied again. The light fell across his hands, weathered now from years of handling goods, of examining quality and negotiating prices. These hands had touched silk from distant lands and grain from local fields, had counted coins and measured lengths of cloth, but their real work had been in the touching itself, in the physical act of connecting one thing to another, one person to another. He thought of his travels to the great markets, the days spent in negotiation with other merchants, the careful selection of goods that would serve his village's needs. Those journeys had seemed like adventures then, opportunities to see the wider world and bring back its treasures. Now he understood that the true adventure had been in returning, in watching how those treasures found their places in the daily lives of people he knew and cared about. The strong box in the corner held the tangible proof of his success, coins accumulated over years of careful trading. But the real wealth lay in the knowledge that his work mattered, that the village functioned more smoothly because of the connections he facilitated. The farmer could focus on growing grain because Aldrich ensured the tools were available. The weaver could create beautiful cloth because the materials arrived when needed. The baker could provide daily bread because the supply of flour never failed. He closed the ledger and placed his palm flat on its leather cover. Tomorrow he would open it again, make new entries, record new transactions. The rhythm would continue, the dance of commerce would go on, needs would arise and be met. But tonight he felt the satisfaction of understanding his true role in this intricate system, the way his individual choices contributed to the larger pattern that sustained them all. The room around him held the accumulated wisdom of his trade, the knowledge of seasons and supplies, of quality and value, of the delicate balance between what people needed and what they could afford. This knowledge had been hard-won, earned through years of mistakes and successes, of learning to read not just the quality of goods, but the needs of people. It was a kind of scholarship, he thought, though it dealt with practical matters rather than abstract ideas. Outside, the village settled deeper into sleep. The sounds of the day had faded, leaving only the occasional footstep on cobblestones, the distant closing of a shutter, the soft murmur of voices through windows. These were the sounds of a community at peace, of people secure in their homes and confident in tomorrow's possibilities. His work had contributed to this security, this confidence, in ways both large and small. The lamp flame burned lower now, its oil nearly spent. Soon he would need to extinguish it and make his way to bed, leaving the counting room to its quiet darkness. But for now he sat in the gentle light, feeling the weight of years well spent, of a life that had found its purpose not in grand gestures, but in the accumulation of small services, small connections, small acts of care disguised as commerce. The ledger beneath his hand contained more than numbers. It held the story of a community's needs and desires, its struggles and celebrations, its daily determination to continue and thrive. His role as merchant had made him a keeper of this story, a guardian of the connections that bound people together across the artificial divisions of trade and transaction. In the morning there would be new needs to meet, new connections to facilitate. The work would continue, as it had for 20 years, as it would for 20 more if fortune smiled upon him. But tonight he rested in the knowledge that this work was worthy, that the life he had built in service to others had been time well spent, that the true measure of wealth lay not in what one accumulated, but in what one enabled others to achieve. The darkness before dawn held a quality that Elena had come to cherish above all other hours, a stillness so complete it seemed to cradle the entire village in its gentle embrace. She moved through her bakehouse with the fluid grace of someone who had performed these same motions countless times, her bare feet finding their way across the worn stone floor without need for conscious thought. The banked coals in the oven glowed like sleeping embers, their warmth radiating through the space and wrapping around her shoulders like a familiar shawl. Her hands reached for the flour without looking, fingers recognizing the texture of each grain as she measured it into the wooden bowl that had belonged to her mother and her mother's mother before that. The weight of tradition settled around her shoulders, not as a burden, but as a comfort. Each generation of women who had risen in darkness to feed their community, now present in the gentle rhythm of her movements. The bowl itself told stories in its worn surface, the smooth depression in its center shaped by decades of mixing, the slight crack along one edge that her mother had refused to mend, saying it gave the bowl character. The water, she added, came from the well her husband had dug 30 years ago, cold and sweet, and as it met the flower, she felt the familiar pleasure of transformation beginning. This was alchemy of the most essential kind, the marriage of simple elements that would become sustenance, become the foundation upon which another day would build itself. Her fingers worked the mixture, feeling it change beneath her touch, growing smooth and elastic, responsive to her guidance. The dough seemed to breathe under her hands, expanding and contracting with each fold, each turn bringing it closer to that perfect consistency she had learned to recognize not through sight, but through the subtle resistance against her palms. In the profound quiet, she could hear her own breathing, steady and unhurried, synchronized with the rhythm of kneading that had become as natural as her heartbeat. The dough folded over itself again and again, each turn releasing a whisper of air, each compression bringing it closer to that perfect consistency she could recognize through touch alone. Flour dusted her forearms, pale against her skin in the dim light, and she found herself thinking of all the mornings she had stood in this exact spot, performing this exact ritual. The wooden counter bore the marks of her labor, worn smooth in the places where she rested her weight, stained dark where countless batches of dough had been shaped and formed. There had been mornings when her children were small, when she would work with one ear, always listening for their stirring, ready to pause her labor if they called for her. She remembered how little Maria would sometimes creep down the stairs in her nightgown, drawn by the scent of baking bread, and how Elena would lift her onto the tall stool to watch the mysterious process of creation. Those small hands had tried to help, leaving tiny fingerprints in the flour, and Elena had never minded the extra mess, understanding even then that she was passing on more than technique, more than recipe. She was transmitting the deep satisfaction of providing for others, the quiet pride that came from essential work done well. There had been mornings when her husband still lived, when she would hear his gentle snoring from the room above and smile at the sound that meant home and safety and the continuation of ordinary life. He would wake to the smell of fresh bread, would appear in the doorway with his hair tousled and his eyes still heavy with sleep, and she would hand him the end piece from the first loaf, still warm from the oven. They had rarely spoken during these early exchanges, both understanding that words would break the spell of the peaceful hour, but his presence had been a comfort, a reminder that her work was witnessed and appreciated. There had been mornings of celebration when she would add honey to the dough for feast days, and mornings of sorrow when the bread she made would comfort families in their grief. She had baked for weddings and funerals, for harvest festivals and holy days, for the simple accumulation of ordinary Tuesdays and Thursdays that made up the bulk of human existence. Each occasion had required its own subtle adjustments to the basic recipe, a little more salt for the laborers who would sweat through long summer days, a touch of sweetness for the children's feast day, extra care in the shaping when the bread would grace a table where important decisions were being made. But this morning felt different, charged with a significance she could not name but recognize nonetheless. As she shaped the dough into loaves, her hands moving with automatic precision, she found herself paying attention to details that usually passed unnoticed. The way the surface of each loaf caught the faint light from the coals, creating tiny shadows in the natural creases of the dough. the particular resistance of the dough as she scored it with her knife, creating the channels that would guide its expansion in the heat. The satisfaction of placing each shaped loaf onto the wooden peels that would carry them to the oven's heart. The knife she used for scoring had been her grandmother's, its blade worn thin from decades of sharpening, but still perfectly balanced in her grip. She could feel the history in its handle, smoothed by 3 generations of women's hands, and she wondered if her granddaughter, now living in the city, would ever return to claim this inheritance of simple tools and accumulated knowledge. The thought brought neither sadness nor anxiety, merely a recognition of the way things changed, the way traditions sometimes ended not through rejection, but through the simple fact of different choices, different lives. She had fed this village for more years than she cared to count, had seen children grow to adulthood on her bread, had watched families expand and contract through the natural rhythms of life and death. Her loaves had graced wedding feasts and funeral meals, had sustained laborers through long days, and comforted the sick through difficult nights. In some essential way, she realized, her life's work had been woven into the very fabric of this community, each day's baking another thread in the tapestry of their shared existence. The bread she made became part of people's bodies, literally sustaining them. But more than that, it became part of their memories, their sense of home, their understanding of what it meant to be cared for. The oven, when she opened its iron door, breathed heat into her face like a living thing. The stones inside glowed with accumulated warmth, ready to transform her carefully shaped dough into golden sustenance. She slid the first loaves into its glowing interior, watching them settle onto the stone floor that had absorbed the heat of thousands of fires. The door closed with its familiar clang, sealing the bread away for its transformation, and she settled into the chair her husband had made for her, positioned perfectly to watch the oven while she waited. The chair itself was a masterpiece of simple craftsmanship, its arms worn smooth by her hands, its seat shaped by her body through years of these quiet vigils. He had made it during the first year of their marriage, when she had complained of backache from standing through the long baking process. The wood was local oak, seasoned for 2 years before he had touched it with his tools, and it had darkened with age to a rich brown that seemed to glow in the firelight. She could remember watching him work on it in the evenings, his careful attention to each joint, each curve, his determination to create something that would serve her well for decades to come. In the growing warmth, with the scent of baking bread beginning to perfume the air, Elena felt a deep contentment settle over her like a blessing. This was her cathedral, this simple room with its worn tools and time-darkened beams. This was her prayer, this daily offering of sustenance to her neighbors. This was her legacy, not in grand gestures or memorable words, but in the accumulation of countless mornings like this one, countless loaves shaped with care and baked with love. The very air seemed to hold the memory of all the bread that had been baked here, all the mornings that had begun with this same ritual of transformation. The scent grew stronger as the bread baked, filling the room with the complex fragrance that meant home to everyone in the village. It was a smell composed of grain and yeast, of fire and time, of care made manifest in the simplest possible way. Elena breathed it in deeply, understanding that she was inhaling not just the aroma of today's bread, but the essence of her entire life's work, the accumulated result of thousands of mornings spent in service to her community's most basic need. The bread would be ready soon, golden and fragrant, and she would carry it to the village square as she had every morning for decades. The baker's boy would help her load the baskets, and together they would walk through streets just beginning to stir with the day's first activity. People would emerge from their houses, drawn by the scent, and she would hand them their daily bread with the same quiet satisfaction she had felt on her very first morning in this role. But for now, in this precious interval between labor and completion, she allowed herself to simply be present in the moment, to feel the satisfaction of work well done, to recognize in this simple act of baking the entirety of her purpose and her peace. The coals settled with a soft whisper, the bread rose silently in the oven's embrace, and Elena closed her eyes, complete in the knowledge that she had given her life meaning through the simple act of feeding others, one loaf at a time. The church stood in perfect silence, its stone walls holding the accumulated prayers of centuries within their ancient embrace. Father Marcus knelt before the altar, his weathered hands folded in an attitude of devotion that had become as natural to him as breathing. The votive candles flickered without sound, their flames steady in the still air, casting gentle shadows that danced across the carved faces of saints who had watched over this congregation since before his grandfather's time. His knees had long since grown accustomed to the hardness of the stone floor, finding in its unyielding surface not discomfort, but a kind of grounding, a physical reminder of his commitment to remain present in this sacred space. The familiar ache that had once distracted him from prayer now served as a meditation in itself, connecting him to the countless priests who had knelt in this same spot, who had offered their own bodies as vessels for devotion. The stone beneath him was worn smooth by generations of knees, polished by the devotion of centuries, and he could feel in its surface the prayers of all who had come before. The altar cloth, worn soft by years of handling, caught the candlelight in gentle folds that seemed to breathe with their own rhythm. He had touched this fabric thousands of times, had smoothed it into place for countless masses, had watched it absorb the tears of grieving families and the joy of wedding celebrations. Its threads held the history of his ministry, each stain and worn spot a testament to the life that had flowed through this sacred space. The linen had been embroidered by the women of the parish decades ago, their careful stitches forming crosses and vines that caught the light in subtle ways, creating patterns that shifted with the movement of the candle flames. In the profound quiet, his thoughts moved beyond the familiar words of prayer into something deeper, a communion that required no language. He had spent so many years wrestling with doubt, questioning whether his faith was strong enough, whether his service was sufficient, whether he had truly answered the call that had brought him to this place. But now, in this moment of perfect stillness, those questions seemed to dissolve into something more fundamental. The very air of the church seemed to hold the accumulated faith of generations, a palpable presence that supported him even when his own certainty wavered. The candlelight played across the walls, illuminating the simple wooden crosses that marked the stations, the worn prayer books stacked neatly in their holders, the baptismal font that had welcomed every child born in the village for the past 200 years. Each object held stories, memories of moments when the sacred had touched the ordinary, when ritual had provided comfort or meaning, or simply a sense of continuity in lives marked by constant change. The font itself was carved from local stone, its basin worn smooth by countless hands, countless drops of blessed water, countless promises made on behalf of children too young to understand the weight of the words spoken over them. He thought of Margaret's hand in his as she lay dying, how she had squeezed his fingers and whispered that she could see her husband waiting for her. Her grip had been surprisingly strong for someone so close to death, and in that moment he had felt himself serving as a bridge between this world and whatever lay beyond, offering his presence as an anchor while she prepared to let go of everything familiar. The room had been filled with family, but it was his hand she had held, his voice she had asked to hear, reading the familiar words of comfort that had sustained her through 8 decades of life. He thought of young Willem, struggling with his place in the world, finding comfort in their quiet conversations by the churchyard wall. The boy had been so restless, so certain that meaning lay somewhere beyond the boundaries of their small community, and Father Marcus had listened patiently as Willem wrestled with questions that had no easy answers. They had talked about calling and purpose, about the difference between adventure and fulfillment, about the way God's will often revealed itself, not in dramatic moments, but in the gradual recognition of where one belonged. Those conversations had taken place over months, Willem returning again and again to worry at the same questions like a dog with a bone, until finally something had shifted and the young man had found his peace. He thought of Elena, bringing him fresh bread each morning with a smile that spoke of faith lived through simple acts of kindness. She never spoke of religion in abstract terms, never quoted scripture or discussed theology, but her life was a testament to the kind of practical holiness that he had come to recognize as the truest expression of faith. The bread she brought was always still warm, wrapped in a clean cloth, and she would leave it on the rectory step with a quiet word about the weather or a gentle inquiry about his health. These small exchanges had become a cornerstone of his days, a reminder that ministry was often less about grand gestures than about the accumulation of small kindnesses. His ministry, he realized, had never been about grand gestures or profound theological insights. It had been about presence, about being available when his flock needed someone to witness their joys and sorrows, to offer the comfort of ritual and the assurance that they were not alone in their struggles. Every baptism had been a celebration of hope, a recognition that life continued to assert itself despite all evidence of mortality and loss. Every funeral had been an affirmation of love that transcends death, a gathering of community around the mystery of what it means to be human. Every ordinary Sunday Mass had been a gathering of souls seeking connection to something larger than themselves, finding in shared ritual and familiar words a sense of belonging that extended beyond the boundaries of their individual lives. The candles continued their silent vigil, their light creating a sphere of warmth that seemed to expand beyond the physical boundaries of the altar. Each flame was steady and sure, fed by wax that had been blessed and set apart for this sacred purpose. Father Marcus felt himself settling deeper into prayer, not the desperate pleading of his younger years, but the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to trust in the mystery of divine love. His breathing synchronized with the gentle flicker of the flames, and he understood that this was what faith looked like in its mature form, not the absence of doubt, but the ability to find peace within uncertainty. The stone beneath his knees seemed to warm slightly, as if responding to his presence, and he thought of all the prayers that had been offered from this spot, prayers of gratitude and desperation, of celebration and mourning, of hope and resignation. The very stones had absorbed these offerings, becoming sanctified not through ritual, but through the accumulated weight of human longing directed toward the divine. He could feel the presence of all who had knelt here before him, their hopes and fears and desperate love creating a kind of spiritual archaeology in the stones themselves. The church around him held its own history in every beam and stone. The wooden pews, carved by craftsmen whose names were long forgotten, bore the marks of generations of worshippers. Children had traced the grain of the wood with small fingers during long sermons. Lovers had carved initials in hidden corners. Mourners had gripped the edges until their knuckles went white. The windows, simple clear glass that let in the natural light without distraction, had witnessed countless moments of human drama played out in the space below. Weddings and funerals, confirmations and confessions, the full range of human experience had unfolded beneath their transparent gaze. He had always wondered if he was doing enough, if his simple faith and quiet service were sufficient for the calling he had accepted. The seminary had prepared him for theological debates and complex moral questions, but the reality of parish life had been far more mundane and, in its own way, far more challenging. There had been no dramatic conversions, no miraculous healings, no moments of obvious divine intervention. Instead, there had been the steady accumulation of small services, quiet conversations, routine rituals that marked the passage of time and provided structure for lives that might otherwise feel chaotic or meaningless. But now, in this moment of perfect communion, he understood that sufficiency was not the measure. Love was the measure. Presence was the measure. The willingness to stand with his people in their moments of greatest need, to offer what comfort he could, to maintain the rituals that connected them to something eternal. This was enough. This had always been enough. The church did not require perfection from its servants, only faithfulness, only the commitment to show up day after day and offer whatever gifts they possessed in service of something larger than themselves. The church around him seemed to pulse with gentle approval, as if the building itself recognized his understanding. The saints carved in stone gazed down with expressions of serene acceptance, their faces worn smooth by time but still radiating the peace that came from lives lived in service to others. Father Marcus felt himself joining their eternal vigil, becoming part of the long chain of faithful servants who had tended this sacred space and its people. He was neither the first nor the last to struggle with questions of adequacy and purpose. And in recognizing this, he found a deep comfort, a sense of belonging to something that transcended his individual doubts and limitations. His prayer deepened into something beyond words, beyond conscious thought, becoming simply a state of being present before the mystery of divine love. The candles burned on, steady and sure, their light a visible symbol of the faith that had sustained him through all the years of service. In that light, in that silence, in that perfect stillness, Father Marcus found the peace that had always been waiting for him, the understanding that his life had been exactly what it needed to be, a quiet offering of love made manifest through simple presence, through the willingness to serve as a bridge between the human and the divine, between despair and hope, between the questions that tormented and the peace that surpassed understanding. The forge held its heat like a living thing, the banked coals glowing red in their bed of ash, pulsing gently with each breath of air that stirred through the workshop. Willem moved around the familiar space with the confidence of someone who had finally found his proper place in the world. his hands sure as they performed the evening ritual of setting everything in order for the coming day. Each tool hung in its designated spot, positioned exactly where his master had taught him, where generations of smiths before had learned that efficiency came from knowing without looking where to reach for what was needed. The hammers, from the massive sledge used for heavy work down to the delicate planishing hammer for finishing touches, rested in perfect alignment. Their handles, worn smooth by countless palms, seemed to retain the warmth of the day's labor, each one shaped by use into an extension of the smith's will and intention. The anvil, that great altar of metalwork, caught the red glow from the coals and reflected it back in a way that made the entire workshop feel alive with possibility. Willem ran his hand along its surface, feeling the slight depression in the center where thousands of hammer blows had gradually shaped the iron itself, creating a perfect bowl for the work that would transform raw metal into tools, horseshoes, nails, and all the countless necessities that kept the village functioning. The anvil's face was polished to a mirror finish from decades of use, and he could see his own reflection wavering in its surface, distorted but recognizable, a young man who had found his calling in the marriage of fire and metal. He had come to understand, over these months of apprenticeship, that the forge was more than a workplace. It was a kind of temple where the ancient mysteries of transformation were enacted daily. Fire and metal, hammer and anvil, the smith's eye and the smith's arm, these were the elements of a ritual as old as civilization itself, passed down through an unbroken chain of masters and apprentices, stretching back to the first human who discovered that iron could be shaped by heat and will. The very walls of the workshop seemed to hold the memory of all the work that had been done here, the accumulated knowledge of generations embedded in the smoke-darkened beams and soot-stained stones. There had been a time, not so long ago, when he had dreamed of adventure, of traveling beyond the boundaries of this small village to see what lay in the wider world. Those dreams had seemed so urgent then, so necessary to his sense of himself as someone destined for greater things. He had stood at the village boundaries, staring down the road that led to distant cities, imagining himself as a soldier or a merchant, a scholar or an explorer, anything but what he was. A blacksmith's apprentice in a place so small it barely appeared on maps. But standing here now, breathing in the familiar sense of coal smoke and heated metal, he realized that his understanding of greatness had undergone a fundamental change. The restlessness that had once driven him to pace the village boundaries, to stare longingly at the road that led to distant cities, had transformed into something deeper and more sustainable. He had found in the work of the forge a channel for all that energy, a way to create and build that satisfied his need for purpose while keeping him rooted in the community that had shaped him. The transformation had been gradual, so subtle that he had barely noticed it happening. At first, the work had seemed merely a way to pass time while he figured out what he really wanted to do with his life. But slowly, almost without his conscious awareness, the rhythm of the forge had begun to match the rhythm of his own heartbeat. The satisfaction of taking raw iron and shaping it into something useful had grown from mild interest to genuine passion. The approval in his master's eyes when a piece was well made had come to mean more than any applause from strangers in distant places ever could. Every piece he crafted, from the simplest nail to the most complex hinge, connected him to the life of the village in ways he was only beginning to understand. The horseshoes he forged carried the farmers to their fields and back, enabling the work that fed the community. The knives he sharpened prepared the food that nourished families, that sustained children through their growing years. The locks he repaired protected the homes where people slept safely, where they stored their most precious possessions, where they raised their children and cared for their elderly. His work, he realized, was woven into the fabric of daily life in ways that made him essential, not in some grand heroic sense, but in the quiet, fundamental way that truly mattered. His master had been patient with his questions, understanding that the young man needed to work through his doubts about choosing this path. The old smith had been through his own period of restlessness as a young man, had even left the village for a few years to work in the city forges, learning techniques that he would later bring back to benefit his home community. But he had returned, drawn by the same forces that were now anchoring Willem: the satisfaction of essential work, the deep connections forged through service, the recognition that mastery was its own reward. Gradually, Willem had come to see that mastery itself was a form of adventure, that there were depths to the craft that would take a lifetime to explore. The way metal moved under the hammer, responding to heat and pressure in ways that seemed almost magical. The precise temperature at which iron became workable, that narrow window between too cold and too hot, that required constant attention and years of experience to recognize by sight and sound, and the subtle changes in the metal's behavior, the subtle differences between various grades of iron, the way each piece of raw material had its own character and requirements, its own possibilities and limitations. These were mysteries as compelling as any he might find in distant lands, puzzles that revealed their secrets only to those willing to dedicate themselves completely to understanding them. He had begun to see that the true adventure lay not in traveling to new places, but in diving deeper into the place where he was, in exploring the infinite possibilities contained within what had once seemed like a simple, repetitive trade. The coals settled with a soft whisper, and Willem carefully adjusted their arrangement, ensuring they would hold their heat through the night and be ready to be coaxed back to full flame in the morning. This too had become a meditation, this tending of the fire that was the heart of all their work. He understood now why smiths spoke of their forges as living things, why they treated the fire with such respect and care. The fire was their partner in the work of transformation, and like any partnership, it required attention, understanding, and mutual respect. Outside, the village was settling into sleep, but the forge maintained its own rhythm, its own sense of time, measured not in hours, but in the cycles of heating and cooling, of creation and rest. Willem felt himself becoming part of that rhythm, his own heartbeat synchronizing with the gentle pulse of the banked coals. This was where he belonged, he knew now with complete certainty. This was his place in the great web of community life, his contribution to the ongoing work of civilization. The tools gleamed dully in the red light, each one an extension of the smith's will, each one shaped by use into perfect efficiency. Willem touched the handle of his favorite hammer, feeling the slight depressions where his grip had begun to wear its own pattern into the wood. In a few years, he thought, this tool would be shaped as much by his hand as his hand had been shaped by learning to use it properly. The thought pleased him, this evidence of the reciprocal relationship between craftsman and craft, the way each shaped the other through years of patient interaction. He could see his future stretching out before him now, not as a series of adventures in distant places, but as a deepening engagement with this work, this community, this life he had chosen. There would be challenges and satisfactions he could not yet imagine, techniques to master, innovations to discover, apprentices of his own to train someday. The forge would continue its ancient work, and he would be part of that continuity, adding his own knowledge and skill to the accumulated wisdom of generations. The forge breathed quietly in the darkness, holding its warmth like a promise of tomorrow's work, tomorrow's creation, tomorrow's small contribution to the ongoing life of the community. Willem smiled as he turned toward the door, carrying with him the deep satisfaction of someone who had found not just work, but calling, not just occupation, but identity in the ancient marriage of fire and metal, skill and service. The restlessness that had once driven him to dream of distant horizons had transformed into something far more valuable, the peace that came from knowing exactly where he belonged. Morning light streamed through the tall window of Margot's weaving chamber, illuminating the completed tapestry that hung before her like a vision made manifest. She stepped back from the loom, her fingers still tingling from drawing the final thread into place, and gazed upon the work that had consumed so many months of patient labor, so many hours of careful attention to detail and color, and the subtle interplay of light and shadow that brought images to life. The tapestry depicted the village in all its seasons, a panoramic celebration of the life she had observed from this very window. Spring appeared in one corner, rendered in the tender greens of new growth, with children playing beneath blossoming apple trees and women hanging washing on lines that seemed to dance in an eternal breeze. Summer dominated the center, all golden grain and blue sky, with harvesters bent to their work, and the church tower rising like a prayer made visible against the azure background. Autumn spread across another section in russets and browns, the trees heavy with fruit, smoke rising from chimneys as families prepared for winter's approach. And winter occupied the final quarter, not as an ending, but as a rest, the village sleeping under a blanket of snow while warm light glowed from windows, suggesting the life that continued within, the stories being told by firesides, the quiet contentment of communities that knew how to sustain themselves through the darker months. But it was the figures that truly brought the tapestry to life, each one rendered with such loving attention that they seemed ready to step from the fabric into reality. There was Elena, her arms dusted with flour, carrying a basket of fresh loaves toward the village square. There was Father Marcus, his hand raised in blessing over a young couple being wed beneath the church's arched doorway. There was Willem at his forge, hammer raised, sparks frozen in mid-flight around his concentrated face. Every person she had ever cared about found their place in this woven world, the baker and the blacksmith, the farmer and the merchant, the children she had watched grow from infancy to young adulthood, the elders whose wisdom had shaped the community's character. She had captured not just their appearances, but something essential about each of them, the particular way Elena tilted her head when listening, the gentle curve of Father Marcus's shoulders as he bent over his prayers, the energy that radiated from Willem even in moments of rest. The work had been painstaking, requiring not just technical skill, but a kind of patient observation that had taught her to see her neighbors with new eyes. Every thread had been chosen with care, every color mixed and tested until it achieved exactly the right tone. She had learned the language of light as it fell across faces at different times of day. had studied the way fabric moved in wind, had observed how shadows could suggest depth and emotion and the passage of time itself. There had been moments of frustration when her vision exceeded her ability to execute it, when the threads refused to lie as she imagined they should, when colors that looked perfect in isolation seemed wrong when woven together. But she had persevered, trusting in the slow accumulation of small decisions, the gradual building of something larger than the sum of its parts. Each day's work had been a conversation between intention and possibility, between the image in her mind and the reality that emerged thread by thread. Now, seeing the completed work in the full light of morning, she felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond personal achievement. This tapestry was more than decoration, more than demonstration of skill. It was a love letter to the community that had shaped her, a testament to the beauty that existed in ordinary life when viewed with sufficient attention and care. She had created something that would outlast them all, a record of this time and place, that future generations might look upon and understand what it meant to live here, to belong to this particular gathering of souls. The morning light continued to shift across the chamber, and with it the tapestry seemed to breathe and change, revealing new subtleties in the weaving that she had not noticed in the focused intensity of creation. The way certain threads caught the light differently than others created an almost imperceptible movement in the fabric, as if the figures might at any moment complete their frozen gestures, as if the children might run beyond the borders of their woven world into the actual village square below. She found herself remembering the very first thread she had placed, how uncertain she had felt about the scope of what she was attempting. The blank warp had seemed impossibly vast then, a challenge that might prove beyond her capabilities. But thread by thread, row by row, the vision had taken shape, and she had discovered that the work itself had taught her what it needed to become. Her hands had learned to move with a confidence she had not possessed at the beginning, guided by an intuition that seemed to emerge from the materials themselves. The colors had been perhaps the greatest challenge and the deepest pleasure. She had spent weeks perfecting the particular shade of green that would capture the new leaves of spring, experimenting with different combinations of dyes until she achieved exactly the luminous quality she sought. The blue of the summer sky had required similar patience, a gradual understanding that the color needed to shift subtly across the expanse to suggest both depth and the particular quality of light that made summer afternoons seem to stretch toward eternity. For the autumn section, she had gathered leaves from the village trees, studying how their colors changed not just from season to season, but from hour to hour as light played across their surfaces. She had learned that brown was not simply brown, but contained multitudes, the warm amber of oak leaves, the deeper russet of maple, the golden bronze of birch. Each tree had its own signature in the tapestry, its own contribution to the symphony of color that made autumn feel like both an ending and a promise. Winter had been the most difficult season to capture, requiring her to find beauty in apparent absence, to suggest the life that continued beneath snow and behind shuttered windows. She had discovered that white, too, was infinitely variable. The blue-white of fresh snow, the gray-white of overcast skies, the warm white of candlelight glimpsed through frost-covered glass. The challenge had been to make winter feel not like death, but like rest, not like emptiness, but like potential. The loom stood empty now, ready for the next project, but Margot found herself reluctant to begin planning what would come next. This work felt complete in a way that transcended its physical boundaries, as if in creating it she had also completed something essential within herself. The restless ambition that had once driven her to dream of distant recognition seemed less important now than the quiet knowledge that she had succeeded in capturing something true and beautiful and worthy of preservation. She thought of her grandmother, who had first taught her to weave, whose patient hands had guided her own through the basic motions that had eventually blossomed into this mastery. Her grandmother had spoken often of the satisfaction that came not from the praise of others, but from the knowledge that one had done good work, work that honored both the materials and the vision that shaped them. Standing before this completed tapestry, Margot finally understood what her grandmother had meant. Sunlight moved across the tapestry's surface, bringing different sections into prominence as the morning progressed, and Margot realized that the work would continue to reveal new details, new relationships between its various elements as light and time played across its surface. Like the village itself, it was a living thing, dependent on the viewer's attention for its full realization, offering new discoveries to those who took time to really see. The chamber filled with the gentle warmth of advancing morning, and somewhere in the village below she could hear the familiar sounds of daily life beginning, the baker's cart rolling over cobblestones, the church bell marking the hour, children's voices calling to one another as they ran toward school. These sounds, which had provided the backdrop to so many hours of weaving, now seemed to emerge from the tapestry itself, as if her work had captured not just the visual essence of the community, but its living spirit as well. She settled into the chair by the window, content to simply observe her creation as it breathed in the changing light, understanding that she had achieved something rare and precious, the transformation of love into art, the preservation of a moment in time that would speak to future hearts of the beauty that could be found in the simplest human community if only one knew how to look. The morning light grew stronger, warming both the chamber and the tapestry within it, and Margot closed her eyes, listening to the eternal rhythms of the village below, knowing that she had succeeded in weaving those rhythms into something that would endure long after the sounds themselves had faded into memory. The village lay in that perfect stillness that comes only in the hour before dawn, when night has released its hold, but day has not yet claimed the world. Aldrich walked slowly through the empty streets, his footsteps the only sound on the worn cobblestones that generations had polished smooth with their passing. Contemplatively, he had risen early, drawn by a restlessness he could not name, and now found himself moving through the familiar lanes as if seeing them for the first time. The merchant's eye that had served him so well in assessing goods and calculating profits now took in different treasures. Thoughtfully, here was Willem's workshop, where the carpenter's hands shaped wood with the same patience his father had shown, and his father before that. The tools hanging on their pegs caught the first pale light filtering through the shutters, each one worn smooth by decades of use, each one a link in an unbroken chain of craft and care. Aldrich paused before the baker's house, where the faintest glow showed beneath the door, and the sweet scent of rising dough already perfumed the morning air. Warmly, Matthias would be kneading the day's first loaves, his movements as rhythmic and sure as breathing, continuing the ancient dance between grain and fire and human need that had sustained this place since before memory. The merchant had often calculated the baker's modest profits, but now he saw wealth of an entirely different kind, the deep satisfaction of feeding one's neighbors, of being essential to the community's daily life. The cobblestones beneath his feet told their own story of belonging. Reflectively, how many feet had worn these paths smooth? How many conversations had been shared over these stones? How many children had played their games here? How many lovers had walked hand in hand through these very streets? Aldrich's own footsteps joined that endless procession, adding his small contribution to the village's living history. A cat emerged from the shadows near the well, regarding him with golden eyes before padding silently away. Peacefully. Even the animals belonged here in ways that went beyond ownership or territory. They were part of the village's fabric, woven into its daily rhythms as surely as the human inhabitants. The merchant smiled, remembering how he had once thought of this place as too small for his ambitions, too limiting for a man with dreams of distant markets and foreign coins. He walked past the houses where his neighbors slept, each one a world complete unto itself, yet connected to all the others by invisible threads of shared experience, tenderly. Behind those shuttered windows lay the Hendersons, who had nursed him through fever when he was 12, the Millers, whose daughter had once shyly offered him wildflowers, old Henrik, who knew every story the village held and told them with the precision of a master craftsman. The morning light grew stronger, touching the thatched roofs with gold and bringing the first stirrings of life to the gardens. Wonderingly, Aldrich saw how each plot of land had been tended with love, how the vegetables grew in neat rows that spoke of hope and planning, how the herbs released their fragrance into the warming air. This was wealth that could not be counted in coins, the wealth of knowing that tomorrow would bring fresh bread, that the seasons would turn as they always had, that the work of hands and hearts would continue. A rooster crowed from somewhere beyond the village edge, and Aldrich felt something settle deep in his chest, a peace he had not known he was seeking. Gratefully, his restless spirit, always pushing toward the next opportunity, the next venture, finally understood what it had been searching for. Not escape from this place, but deeper entry into it. Not distance from these people, but closer connection to their shared life. He thought of the letters he had written to merchants in distant cities, the plans he had made for expanding his trade beyond the village boundaries. Softly, those dreams seemed suddenly hollow, like echoes in an empty room. What profit could compare to the wealth of belonging? What distant treasure could match the value of being known, truly known, by the people who shared his daily life? The sun climbed higher, and smoke began to rise from more chimneys as the village stirred to life. Contentedly, Aldrich could picture the morning routines beginning behind each door, mothers rising to tend their fires, fathers preparing for the day's work, children slowly waking to the promise of another day in the only world they had ever known. He was part of this pattern, woven into it as surely as the threads in Martha's tapestries. A door opened somewhere behind him, and he heard the soft murmur of voices, the gentle sounds of a household beginning its day. Lovingly, the merchant realized that he had spent years looking beyond these sounds, seeking something grander, more exciting. Now he heard them as the most beautiful music he had ever known, the symphony of ordinary life lived with care and attention, the quiet heroism of people who showed up for each other day after day, season after season. He walked toward the village green, where the great oak stood sentinel over the community's heart. Reverently, how many generations had gathered in its shade, how many decisions had been made beneath its branches, how many celebrations shared, how many sorrows comforted. The tree's roots ran deep into the same earth that held the bones of all who had called this place home, and its branches reached toward the same sky that would shelter the children yet to be born here. Aldrich placed his hand on the oak's rough bark and felt the slow, patient pulse of life that had sustained this place through countless seasons. Peacefully. His merchant's mind had always moved quickly, calculating, planning, anticipating the next transaction. But the tree taught him a different rhythm, the deep time of growth and endurance, the quiet persistence that built lasting things. The village was fully awake now, and Aldrich could see his neighbors beginning their daily routines warmly. There was no drama in these moments, no grand gestures or momentous events, just people living their lives with the steady grace that comes from knowing one's place in the world, from being part of something larger than oneself. The merchant had once thought this ordinariness was a limitation, but now he saw it as the rarest and most precious gift. He walked slowly back toward his own house, seeing it now not as a temporary shelter, but as his true home. Gratefully. The rooms that had sometimes felt confining now seemed like a perfect frame for a life well lived. The garden that had required such careful tending revealed itself as a partnership with the earth itself, a daily lesson in patience and hope. As he reached his door, Aldrich turned for one last look at the village spreading out before him in the morning light. Deeply moved, every roof, every garden, every curling thread of smoke spoke of human persistence and care. This was his true inheritance, not the coins he had saved or the goods he had traded, but the privilege of belonging to this community of souls who had chosen to build their lives together. Gentle morning breeze. The merchant stepped inside his house and felt, for the first time in years, that he was exactly where he belonged. Contentedly, his restless heart had found its harbor, not in distant shores, but in the familiar streets where his footsteps joined the eternal procession of those who had chosen to call this place home. Softly. In the kitchen, he could hear his wife beginning to stir, and he smiled, knowing that this day would unfold like all the others, ordinary, precious, and complete. Birds singing softly. Outside his window, the village continued its ancient rhythm, each person playing their part in the endless story of community and care. Peacefully. And Aldrich understood, with the clarity that comes only in moments of perfect stillness, that he had been searching his whole life for what had been here all along, the irreplaceable wealth of belonging, the quiet treasure of home. Sleepily, the morning light grew stronger, promising another day of the simple, profound miracle of life lived in common cause, and the merchant closed his eyes, finally at peace. Fading. In the distance, church bells began their gentle call to prayer, and all was as it should be. Join us for more quiet moments from history, where literary storytelling meets peaceful sleep. Subscribe for stories that honor both the art of narrative and the gift of rest.